Wow. Thank you very much. I'm not quite sure what to say. I've actually had quite a long interest in the airships of 1909. In fact, I think I collected my first account, a newspaper account, about 32 years ago. I just realised that a couple of days ago. But the thing is, no one has really asked me to talk about them except in the last couple of years when I said that I was thinking of writing a book. And in particular, I got together with a gentleman called Peter Fleury, who's now back in New Zealand, in Dunedin, and we've been combining our information and trying to come up with some really good material. There's some brilliant material, and I hope to show that some of that here this afternoon. First of all, can I have the first slide, please? Okay, for those of you who don't know, this is New Zealand. Basically, the main area for in 1909, there are a series of Zeppelin-like craft seen over New Zealand and in Australia, particularly centred around this area in Dunedin, around Dunedin, slightly south and to the west of it, which at this time of the year, and at that time of the year too, was pretty cold, as you can imagine. Now, I want to particularly just dwell on the early material, the stuff that comes from the very first sighting that was reported, why the whole thing sort of really got out of control, as it were, and became New Zealand's biggest ever UFO flap. And then look at some of the more interesting Australian material that Peter and I have been particularly coming up with in the last few years. It's a lot harder to get, unfortunately. Now, I would first of all like to show you a map of how it got started. Okay, this area is, Dunedin City itself is up about here off this map. Now, what happened essentially was that on the 11th of July in 1909, a number of people were seeing some friends off at the railway station. Oh my goodness, I can't even focus on it here. Over here at a place called Stirling. Looking across, they noticed an unusual series of lights over the Kaitangata Hills out over the area known as Wongaloa. Now, this is only about 10-15 kilometres away. They watched for about half an hour. They saw their friend off on the train, I believe. And then one of the men sort of started walking back home. He was then watched this aircraft. The lights then reappeared again. And they seemed to sort of come in, circle over, and then follow him and go up inland, where they disappeared in what he said was the direction of the Blue Mountains. Now, I'll just switch to another map here. Right. Once again, here we have the Wongaloa Hills, and the thing to particularly notice here is the Clutha River. The Clutha is a very large, very dynamic river with a lot of water in it. It appears that the airship, as was called then, moved up the Clutha River until it came to a bunch of hills. They're certainly mountains by Australian standards. They're really a little bit more than hills by New Zealand standards. And it was just seen here disappearing in this direction, and no one quite knew what happened to it. Nothing much more happened for the next couple of weeks until all of a sudden this little township, this red dot here, a place called Kelso, started to report a series of very, very unusual phenomena. These were daylight sightings. Now, could I please have the next map, thanks? This is the township of Kelso as it never was. Basically, this is a plan of the town as it was designed to be in 1875. It's at the conjunction of a stream here and a rather large river. The area floods a lot. You can see this by the Oxbow Lakes. And the result is that every now and then it gets a really dramatic flood occurs in this area. In fact, it's so dramatic that about 15 years ago, the township had to be done away with. They had a series of 100-year floods within about 4 or 5 years. And they had so many, in fact, that they decided to abandon the site. All the houses were carted away, and the township of Kelso just doesn't exist anymore, which is really rather sad. But in 1909, suddenly, it became very much the centre of attention in New Zealand. The account that you've probably seen most of, next slide please, is from an account that comes in the Otago Daily Times, the newspaper that comes out of Dunedin, a very well-considered newspaper. Now, basically, a daylight sighting, this airship was seen to come out from the area to the to the east of Kelso itself, circle over the town, and then head back the way it had come back towards the Blue Mountains. It went from, seemed to have come out from here, came out over the town, and then children watching it at midday, thereabouts, went back to the Blue Mountains. It was also witnessed by one woman, Mrs. Russell. And this has always been the story as far as most people have taken it. However, the Otago Daily Times also put out a weekly newspaper called the Otago Witness. And I avoided actually looking up this particular publication for a number of years because I thought, in fact, it was probably some sort of religious publication. Next slide, please. Then someone said, have you tried looking at the Otago Witness because it includes photographs? And suddenly, here is a photograph of Mrs. Russell, the person who confirmed what the children had seen, and with her family. And I, in fact, have seen another photograph. This is actually taken from a book called Kismet for Kelso, written by a local historian, Mrs. Brownlee. And I think it's wrongly attributed. I think, in fact, some of the children along here are some of the same children who produced the diagrams that we've just seen before. Next slide, please. The other interesting photograph that appears about in the same area, in the same publication of the Otago Witness, is this. It shows the area where it was actually taken, now, where it was actually sighted. Now, this, okay, to the east of Kelso itself, there's a bit of a hill here called the Wooded Hill. Nowadays, it's just covered with gorse and scrub. It's rather derelict. In those days, it was probably pretty derelict as well. I think all the trees were chopped down, which probably contributed to the flooding that you get in the area. But on this particular day, I think it was the 26th of July, at lunchtime, the kids had been the school bell had rung. The township's only a couple of miles long. The children had been let out of the school, probably to go home for lunch, and a number of them reported this object just after 12 o'clock. We've seen it come out from behind the wooded hill, at this point here, turn around, and then go back. And there's a couple of numbers here which indicate where two of the major witnesses were. This indicates that, in fact, they were probably less than 100 meters from the actual object itself. So, we've had a quick look at the actual pictures that the children had produced. Recently, we've been having a look at how big the aircraft actually was. It's quite important when you're dealing with balloons. It definitely wasn't, for example, an aeroplane. This is probably our first attempt at what the Kelso airship. In New Zealand, there were so many sightings from around Kelso area, they were usually referred to as the Kelso airship. The colour was black, and I've included up in this corner here, this is an outline of Blériot's aircraft that had just crossed the channel. One of the reasons we believe why it suddenly became such a big issue was because Blériot had just crossed the English Channel. And the whole thing was treated as a huge success. Everyone was absolutely triumphant about it. Some of the reports in the newspapers at the time were quite ecstatic that at long last, man had conquered the English Channel. It showed for the first time that aeroplanes were a distinct commercial possibilities, a form of transport. They weren't just a rich man's toy. And people began to get very, very excited. The other big development that was going on in Europe at the same time was, of course, Count Zeppelin's experiments with airships. Now, I'll go into those in just a moment. And of course, airships were in fact seen in many ways as being much more successful as aeroplanes. These are still being, Blériot and his friends were being considered very much as playing around with toys. But the channel was sort of changing all that very, very quickly. In the meantime, people were still very much aware of of airships. And the Kelso airship itself was seen as being, okay, some local inventor probably playing around with the aircraft, with a balloon and building a balloon. There was a very real problem, however, that balloons, in fact, at that time required an awful lot of effort. Now, as I've said, this is our very first attempt to draw the airship. And I think in recent months, I've been looking at it again, and I'm not too happy with it. Can I have the next slide, please? But the main reason why we did this, went through this exercise, was to have a look at the size of the gas envelope, because that determines how much lifting power your balloon has got. If you presume, for example, this is filled with hydrogen, then you can sort of get an estimate of how much weight it can lift and how big this thing would have to be. Now, at the same time, if we look at the most up-to-date aircraft in the world at the time, this is Zeppelin's L5, which later on became Zeppelin 2. This thing is absolutely massive. It is several hundred feet long. It's got over 500,000 cubic feet of gas in it, hydrogen mostly. These things are so big, they actually built them out over lakes for two reasons. First of all, you need a nice big flat surface to build it on, and they built these floating hangars on lakes. The other reason was that lakes, of course, contained water. Hydrogen is very inflammable, and by surrounding themselves with water, it was thought less likely for the hydrogen to catch on fire. I mean, they were dealing with really dangerous stuff. This is 1909 high-tech. The other high-tech development, as I put it down here, is Blériot's aeroplane. Top speed, if I remember correctly, of about 40 miles an hour. The top speed of these balloons, these big Zeppelins, is only about 30 miles an hour. By comparison, on the same scale, these are all on the same scale, this is the size of the Kelso airship. Now, I've been rather generous. If I'd made it any smaller, it obviously isn't a balloon, and it reduces the lifting capacity of it, it reduces the size of the envelope. So if you're looking at something like this, this Kelso airship, it would still only have an effective lifting capacity of about 100 to 150 kilos, which is not a lot. So it makes you start to wonder, perhaps, there's something else here, that it really wasn't a balloon. Now, as I've said, I've recently been looking at redrawing this because some of the drawings and some of the descriptions don't quite fit. There is a problem with this basic shape here in that you don't have, and many of you will see this in things like barrage balloons, you have a fin built in at the back for stability. Now, in those days, people were still coming to terms with the language. Quite often, for example, they didn't refer to a propeller at the back spinning, they said it was like a wheel. And of course, when you think back to 1909 and what wheels were like, you had spoked carriage wheels. When they sort of are rolling along very fast, of course, the spokes tend to sort of, develop that special propeller-like look. And the children actually describe a wheel on the back spinning very quickly. This wheel figure is very common through so many of the accounts of the airships that were seen in New Zealand and Australia at the time. People saw reflections of this thing at the back. What I believe that instead how you had at the time of the airfin, I actually think that the gas bag was probably flatter up there. This is still sort of the bottom view, but the top, the side view will make this much flatter. You would still have the gondola down the bottom. And from what I've seen, and other descriptions, what was often described as sails was in fact a kind of rudder. These kinds of rudders here were in fact used in some of the earlier French models of aircraft, of balloons, to give it stability, to stop it so you could actually guide it as it went along, keep it on the straight and narrow and level. That would be the idea of these kinds of sails, or in this case, ailerons. The ailerons on this side, for example, or the stabilizing fins here, would keep it, so as you go along like that. These would sort of help keep it moving straight ahead. The problem about this particular design is, from an aeronautical point of view, is it's really not very stable. Given the New Zealand weather conditions, this is really rather dangerous. You're really much better to go for the traditional, well, what we now call a traditional barrage balloon design with a fin sticking up at the back. But I think that this particular one, once I've modified this and put on these other structures that were mentioned and provided in some drawings, then we'll have something which is much closer to the Kelso airship. Interestingly, it makes it like no other airship that has ever been designed, or will probably ever be designed, because of these structures here. So it all just adds interest to it. Now, the other interesting thing about the airships is that they were also seen in Australia. And really, this was an Australasian phenomenon. It wasn't just in New Zealand. The thing is that in New Zealand, okay, the distances were not as great as in Australia. You had a large number of newspapers which carried good accounts of local events. And it's quite noticeable that when you go through the literature and all the newspaper material, that when people are commenting on something a long way from them, they tend to sort of take in more of the myths, like there are accounts of people actually hearing voices coming from the aircraft, talking possibly in German or something like that, or French or some foreign tongue. When you actually go to the local newspapers where this was meant to have occurred, you don't get those details coming out. This is an embellishment that occurred later. And you tend to get more of these embellishments the further you are away from it. Now, It became obvious during Peter Fleury and my investigations that these are also seen in Victoria. We kind of thought that at the time this was a copycat event. But there are certain accounts. This one is from the Otago Daily Times, for example. It refers to the Dandenongs, an area just southeast of Melbourne itself, where a reverend gentleman was staying for the weekend, and he and his neighbours watched a series of lights. Now, surprisingly enough, his account, which is one of the first accounts from this particular period in 1909, is very similar to the very first accounts we had from Wongaloa, Stirling, Balclutha, that sort of thing. It's surprisingly similar in many qualities to the lights that were seen at that time. It's also very similar to so many UFO accounts that UFO investigators like myself, come across today. Now, can I have the next map, please? It's in Australia. Okay, fine. Dandenongs down here. Also seen people on a train, that the Melbourne to Sydney Express around Hilltop and Picton was also reported. They watched it for quite some time. The parallels between this and the quality of the reporting from people who would not be aware of the actual what had been happening in New Zealand, aware of the details, is very similar to example for something that was reported from the west coast of the South Island of New Zealand, where a large number of people on a train going from Hokitika to Greymouth reported seeing this balloon light, this object out to sea, a light bobbing up and down with a waving, undulating motion, very similar to what was seen at Hilltop. Okay, it was also, I have a report that comes from Zealand in Tasmania. I'm having difficulty verifying that because, once again, local libraries in Australia don't always have very many copies of newspapers from other states. They don't always have very good copies of old newspapers. You really need to be in the area. The Zealand account is alluded to by Sydney newspapers, but I cannot find any direct account of it. An account over here, the suburb, I think, of Pingelly in Perth, a fairly sceptical account on the Western Australia about something that had been seen there. And later on, the latest account of one which I find very interesting because it's actually a chance for Peter Fleury and myself to try and validate some of the working assumptions that we've been coming to by going through all this material. It comes from the 25th of October, Onslow, up here in northwest Australia. Basically, I think this is a very, very, very good sighting. On October the 25th, Mrs. A.J. Rowe, wife of the manager of Minderoo Station near Onslow, was the first to spot the strange craft. It looked compact like a dirigible balloon, a bit like the Kelso Airship I had previously shown. Mrs. Ross said, but appeared to be squarer and more like an aeroplane. That might well explain the extra wings and things that it seemed to have on the ailerons. The sun shone on it and flashes came from it. That flashes came from it is very similar to New Zealand accounts where flashes of light were seen coming off the propeller or the wheel at the back, as though reflected from something revolving or from metalwork. 3 station hands also saw the object, which the newspapers of the day described as a mystery airship, and one of them made a sketch of it. The customs collector at Onslow, Mr. Elsie Temperley, submitted a detailed report on the sighting to the Minister of Customs, who passed it on to the Defence Department. Mr. Temperley thought that the object really was an airship. The work, he suggests, of an inventor who was experimenting, or perhaps from a foreign vessel anchored off the coast. This is one thing, too, that's extremely interesting as far as I'm concerned as a researcher. The comparison of the arguments that people made for what the object was at the time. It was obviously from some sort of a ship off the coast, perhaps a German ship that's lost and gone astray. It was perhaps the work of some inventor. Now, Peter and I spent an awful lot of time investigating what local inventors were doing at the time. It certainly wasn't. It's also quite outside the technology that was available at the time. And this particular case, I really would like to pursue it if I can, but it's very difficult. I presume we have to go to Perth to follow it up, to see if I can get a copy of the report that was made in 1909 to the Defence Department. Presumably that is still filed away somewhere. It'd be a wonderful item to have to sort of verify many of the assumptions that we've been working on at this stage. Now, oops, okay. I'm afraid I've had to give you a very, very quick tour of this. There's a heap of information available. There are lots of, a huge number of newspapers around, a significant number of them in Australia, which have this material in it. And we really need to follow this up because it's a very, very interesting area. Nowadays, I think one of the things we've always got to look at is, could we do, what would it take for us to build a Kelso airship today? And obviously, we'd certainly go about it differently. We could probably build one, I think, that would work probably much better than the original, in fact, fairly cheaply for perhaps a few $1,000s. But in those days, when you look at the technology that was going on, the kind of advances that people were making in aircraft, you've got to look at this very, very seriously indeed. Now, while some academics have looked at this subject of the airships of 1909, they tend to see it as being a response to the arms build-up that was going on in the Northern Hemisphere just before World War I. And they sort of say that, this is people saying, that this is the Germans scared down under. People were scared of airships. But I would like to go back to the very, very first account that came through in New Zealand. And in fact, it's very similar in many respects to the same sort of accounts as when Louis Blériot flew the Channel. People were quite ecstatic. They thought, at long last, someone had done something fantastic with airships. And in this particular case, I should point out, too, that some of the causes that were discussed was also Mars. Mars was fairly close to the Earth at this time. And this article, this Mars argument was actually revived in the 1950s, 1954 in New Zealand, as being another indication that Mars, close to the Earth in 1909, close to the Earth in 1954, was in fact a source of these objects. It was quite an elegant debate undertaken in New Zealand at the time. But finally, I'd like to end up with one of the very first accounts from the Bell-Clutha Free Press. We can't find the original. Surprisingly enough, although there's a lot of newspaper material about, the Bell-Clutha Free Press does not appear to be one of them, particularly for this period. There may be a copy of it somewhere in the Wellington archives associated with Parliament. But the person who saw the object, their feeling was this. It was not one of fear of the Germans. It was that if that is the explanation that it was a local inventor, concluded our informant, the inventor has struck something that will knock Count Zeppelin and Wilbur Wright sideways. For as I gazed at that grand light sailing easily through space on Sunday night, I involuntarily ejaculated, "My, what would I not give to be on that ship?" It seemed to embody the very poetry of aerial motion. Now, to me, that is not so much the expression of despair as many historians would have you believe. It is really a sense of excitement that something was going on, and the same sort of excitement that many UFO investigators find today when we first go out to talk to people who've had a UFO sighting. Now, I'll finish at that. Thank you very much. I would urge you, if you have an interest, to look up your own newspapers, your own local newspapers at the time in Australia, wherever you're from, particularly from West Australia. You may well find that there are very, very good accounts of airships or early UFOs in them for that period. Thank you.